Hi, Rigsters here, back with another DCS video. For this video, I'm going to show you some of the key bindings I used for DCS's version and take on the F-16C Block 50. So let's get started. So to change the controls in the main menu, click on the gear icon here. And if you have multiple modules, make sure you click on the top left drop down here, make sure it says F-16C, because that's what we're using. And on the middle right here is a whole bunch of panels you can sort it by. And you can also type these in. We're just going to click on access commands because obviously if you're just starting out, you may want to take a look in here depending on what you use. So the first thing I do is if you have a head tracking unit, head trackers such as Track IR, the Land Clip, or Monkey Grass, the head tracker settings below form knob is what I would take a look at first. And you can customize these settings on the given softwares. Like for example, on the Land Clip and Track IR, they have their own ways of modifying the axis. I'm just going to briefly touch it just to recommend something that may help, particularly in the pitch. In the pitch axis, head tracker pitch, if you right click on here, you'll see this drop down menu. It says add combo, tune combo axis, clear combo, reset the default. Most of the time, you're going to be either tuning or clearing combos if you go line by line. For this one, we're going to tune. I personally like when I move my head up and down for head tracking to have the limiter be reached very quickly, because what this does is when you hit that 50 limit in DCS, it means that it will reach your maximum pitch angle much faster depending on how you set it up in OpenTrack or in Track IR's case, their own perspective software. This is how I do it for a pitch. You just move the saturation X, or you type in the number to the box to the right to 50. I usually recommend typing the number in because you want to make sure you don't have the slider go to, like, say 32 when you slide it around, or 51. You want it exactly 50, 50, if you want to do this. This is not required, but it is something I highly recommend doing. Then click on the bottom right, the green OK button. And you can do the same things for the other axis. So for the joystick, you want to go to pitch right here. And in this one, I double left clicked it just to show you what it looks like for if you want to bind a particular axis depending on what device you want to use for pitch. Obviously for joysticks, you want to move it up and down, and it will even tell you, if you already have it set, which I do in this case, it will even tell you at the bottom right here, currently in use, pitch. Of course, I don't want to actually apply the change, so I'd hit cancel. This is also the same screen where you can also see what are the key buttons for that particular device you could set it to if you really wanted to, or a modifier, which is more useful for non-axis control related settings. Obviously, if you're using the joystick, you don't need a modifier for pitch. But that's just how you would do it. So you set the pitch. By default, when I right click on pitch and hit tune combo axis, these will all be like 0, 100, 100, and curvature 10. I personally find with my joystick in particular, for the VKB GladSim Evo Premium, which is a mouthful, is for the F-16, setting a very small dead zone and a small curvature between 5 to 10 for the pitch axis seems to make it less twitchy in certain situations. Now there is a drawback to doing this. Long story short, when you add the dead zone, it means you lose a little bit of the center axis smoothness. But if you keep it very small and you adjust it with a small curvature, it eventually becomes more helpful in certain situations, especially for air refueling. And it's also entirely a preference thing. You do not have to copy these settings exactly line by line, but these are stuff you want to look into and see what works best for you. I would not recommend doing a ridiculously high dead zone, regardless of axis. If you have to set a dead zone higher than, say, 30, depending on the joystick and situation, you may want to get a different peripheral or get a different joystick of some kind. Because after you go past 30 dead zone, it's not going to be very helpful. That's just the thing I've noticed or observed. Okay. The next thing you need is roll, which is your left and right. And as you can see as I move my joystick, just to demonstrate what happens when you set the roll and pitch, you see these white bars moving. And as the white bar moves, you can see when it's like full or not. So another thing you can do is the RDR Cursor Switch X-axis and Y-axis. What these does is it moves the little radar cursor for various screens that you'll be interacting with on a pretty frequent basis. And when I move that around, you'll see with a little hat here on my VKB one, there's a lot of joysticks that will have at least something that you could use for it. Some you might have to press a button to engage from digital to analog mode, or vice versa, depending on which stick you use. And the only thing I'll mention here briefly is I found a very small dead zone of 1 and the saturation Y axis to 85 doesn't make it too jumpy or too slow. You don't want to lower it too much for the Y axis for the RDR cursor, but you may find it might be too jumpy by default 100. So this is where you would tune it as well. So rudder, not used very often in the F-16 in normal flight. There is uses for it, obviously. Since this is a twist stick, I just twist the stick left and right. It's mostly used for steering on the ground, but there is times where you use it in the air to do very minute adjustments. It's a fly-by-wire aircraft, so you don't heavily use the rudder in them, but it's still something you want to bound, or at least have handy. And of course, thrust, which I have a throttle, or you use a slider wheel, or whatever else you use for denoting that. This is where you would tune that. Usually by default, you just keep it at the default saturations. If you want to go really crazy, you can check user curves and set up your own curve that way. And there is software on Google that you can use to help with that. But my particular stick, and there are some others that have this too, where you can have physical detents through their own software, so it's not needed for my case, but you may find that to be useful. Don't forget to click OK once you set it. One last tip with thrust is sometimes with some throttles like mine, you have to invert the command, because if you don't do that, it will assume it will be at 100% and it'll fully afterburn and crash into stuff. If you find that happening, try checking the invert box, so that way down is down and up is up for the binding. It's just a weird little quirk this particular unit has. It's very fixable with software, obviously. You just check the box and then that's it. Okay. Let's go to the top left screen here to all but access commands. And I'm going to just press buttons on my stick. There are some settings I will gloss over. I'm not going to cover every single one. I'm just going to cover the ones that I actively use or recommend. So the first one is camera gun trig, first detent, if you have a 2-stage axis on the trigger. Not all joysticks have a 2-stage trigger, or if you might not have enough buttons to do 2 stages. The only one you need in that case then is just do the second detent. The first detent, what it's used for is for lasers, like for laser bombing or laser buddy lasing. That's what it's primarily used for. NWS-AR Disc Missile Step Button. Mouthful, and it sounded like Spud Knocker for a moment there. What this does is it turns off and on the nose wheel steering when you're on the ground, and in the air it steps the missiles, and also if you're in air to ground mode it steps the bomb delivery mode. That's what it's primarily used for. Expand FOV Button Depress is a situational button. It is recommended to still bind. It's one of the very few buttons in the F-16 I don't actively use, but it's one of those nice to haves. There is some functions that do use this, but it's not a critical one. It is something that's recommended. Zoom in and zoom out slow. That's always mandatory. Even with head tracking, I don't like it using my head to look in and out for zooming in and out. It's more useful if you have VR, if you want to do it by your actual head. But for most people, including me, we use zoom in slow and zoom out slow on flat screens. It allows you to zoom in and zoom out, like the name implies. Do not do the non-slow. If you do the non-slow, it instantly jumps, which I don't think you would want. You can do that if you want to, but I wouldn't do that unless if you have a button box or you prefer that. Target management switch. Up, down, left, right. This is how you lock onto targets and engage various targeting submodes. Particularly for the air to ground one, target management switch right, when deployed to a targeting pod, will switch the camera modes, for instance. I won't go into too much more detail on that, but that's an example. Up locks stuff, down deselects or unlocks stuff. That's what that's used for. Display management switch, down, left, right, up. This shows your 3 screens, your helmet, and also various submodes. Extremely useful. The submode switching, which is DMS left and right, that's what it's called for short. The left and right, what that does is it cycles your little sub-menus on your left and right screens, which are near your knees in the cockpit. What it does is you can instantly switch from, say, like the targeting pod to radar. That's just a brief example. Down and up. Down will cycle between the 2 screens in the cockpit and the helmet. Up usually is for the helmet and your HUD, your heads-up display unit, the glass in front of your nose. That will make those swing. Landing gear. You can just get away with 1 button for this. If you have a 2-way or 3-way switch, you can do down and up. Or if you have just 1 button, just use up/down. What it says does on the tin. It extends and retracts the landing gear. UNCAGE Switch. A recent button I actually discovered through the community. What this basically does, long story short, is when you're using AIM-9 sidewinders, particularly the M's and the X, it allows the seeker head to be less restricted in looking for heat signatures. That's what it's primarily used for. There is probably some other sub-functions that I have to look into, but that's what it's primarily used for. What else do we have? This is an optional but very helpful button, so you don't have to click on it with your mouse. Autopilot pitch switch altitude hold, or ALT hold, straight and level. Basically keeps your aircraft straight and level. Also recommend, if you do that, is to also have pitch switch AP off, so that way you can turn it off without having to yank the aircraft. Another one, Weapon Release Button Depress. This is your pickle button, your stores jettison, and fires various bombs. It also fires rockets as well. This is how you fire your missiles too, because the gun trig for this plane only fires the laser guns, depending on the stage and how you set it up. But the weapon release button you're going to be pressing a lot. That's your primary fire the weapons button. I know I'm going like a little out of order, but I'm just doing it button by button. Trim button, nose up, nose down, left wing down, right wing down. These are extremely useful and are highly recommended on a 4-way switch or hat, especially left wing and right wing down. There are times where you might have an off-balance load when you release certain weapons, so you want to be able to trim that by tapping the button. If you want to trim your aircraft, this is how you do it. Speed brake. The SPD BRK Switch. Aft/extend, momentary, and forward/retract. What this does, we'll start with retract first. Retract, what it does is it retracts your speed brake. It's a single button press. If you do speed brake switch aft/extend momentarily, you hold this button down to deploy the speed brakes. There is an indicator in the cockpit that's not easy to see, but it is there to let you know when the speed brakes are out. You need this for landing or doing, if you want to really slow down in a hurry, or sometimes occasionally used in formation flying if you need to touch up. Optional, but recommended, is the air refuel switch close and open, a 2-way button switch, 2 buttons. It's a single press for each action. What it does is it opens and closes your air refuel door. If you don't have a button for it, you can also click inside the cockpit. It's not conveniently located, but it is there if you want to use the mouse to click on it. I like to bind it to a button. That's just my preference. Missile toe knob. Counterclockwise decrease, clockwise increase. This basically what it does is it increases and decreases the AIM-9 Sidewinder tone. Because trust me, the default volume is really loud and will hurt your ears. So usually you're going to be decreasing more often than increasing. It's very loud. Threat toe knob, counterclockwise decrease, clockwise increase. Same thing as missile, but this is for when there's a target hard locking you or you're getting locked up by radar from any source that the radar warning receiver yells at you saying, hey, you're getting locked up, look out, kind of thing. Recommended, not mandatory, but I personally prefer to have this bound to either a rotary knob or a button. Something that I recently started doing in a lot of my aircraft is finding these seat adjustment switches. For the F-16, the seat ADJ switch down/off and up/off basically does what it says. If you press and hold the button, it will lower the seat for down and up raises the seat. And we're almost done. The throttle idle switch. Right shift home is not something that I really use that often, but I'd rather have it bound to a button. This makes it easier to when you're cold starting the F-16. You don't have to fiddle around with the mouse to try to get it to click in. This will click it in for you. Chair, you know, like the singular chair. Chaff/flare dispense button. This is how you deploy your countermeasures depending on missile programming mode, or not missile, countermeasure programming mode. Countermeasures management swift aft, forward, left, and right. Recommend to bind all of them. Most of the time you're going to press forward if you like the bypass method, which is I personally prefer. it drops one chaff and flare when you set the knob to BYP. That is something I'll show and talk about in the future. The A/A Refueling Ready for pre-contact radio call. Useful universal button. I always have this bound to something that I can easily reach, because nothing frustrates players more than having to use the / key and having to constantly spam the button. This makes it much easier, so you have a one button press instead of having to use the keyboard and hunt and peck for it. Man RNG knob, counterclockwise and clockwise. What this does is it zooms in and zooms out your targeting pod. Antenna elevation knob, CCW and CW. What this does is it raises and lowers the altitude for your radar screen for air-to-air and air-to-ground radar antenna elevation. Very useful. Both of these should be bound to either a rotary knob or two buttons that you can press and hold, or lightly press, depending on your preference. And last but not least, the Enable Switch Depress. This is used for helping to align your helmet when you do the helmet align process. It's used in various sub-modes of the plane. Definitely want to have it handy. Definitely recommended to have somewhere you can easily reach, because I don't think you would want to struggle outside of that. Radio switch call menu. What this does is it'll bring up the call menu for UHF and VHF. There are different radios the F-16 uses. Most of the time you're going to use UHF to bring up that menu, and VHF, which brings intercom flights, which is basically just people locally close to you that are other F-16s or other planes tuned to your frequency. So that's about it for this video for button blinding for the F-16, what I use and recommend. Hope you enjoyed this video. On the next time for the F-16, we'll do a cold start. This is Rigsters Journey, signing off.